First up, we have Thérèse Caruso from Zeno Group. Thérèse, when I saw the research you guys had done around values, I was immediately intrigued. Tell us a little bit about what Zeno Group is and how long you've been doing this research to begin with, please.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. So Zeno Group is an integrated marketing firm, and we say we're born from public relations. And we have been doing research now on values for at least the last decade. I've been tracking values now for probably over 20 years. And we have our own IP called the Human Project. And the Human Project tracks the values, the differentiating values of different generations. And we track all the generations.
And so what we're going to do is dive in and look at these massive changes that have been going on in the last couple of months across all the different kind of demographics, Gen Z, Boomers, Gen X. First of all, I think you were saying, Thérèse, you've never seen this fast a shift in values before, correct?
We have not. I mean, usually people hold values very dear. And when we do see shifts, we think there is something big going on. But since January of 2020, we've seen some dramatic shifts. And this is among all generations across the board. And actually, the shifts that we're seeing are most akin to the Great Depression.
Well, let's dive in. Let's take a look at some of these slides and the presentation that you have, Thérèse, and we'll come back at the end to do a little bit of a conversation. But yeah, this is super fascinating stuff in terms of if you're working for a brand, a nonprofit, what people are feeling out there as well. And as mentioned, you can keep the questions coming in using the Q&A function at the bottom there. Yeah, please hit us up. We're looking forward to a stimulating discussion at the end. Thérèse, how's it going? Are you okay? I can help if you're having some difficulty. I have the presentation here.
Oh, please do. It's telling my share screen is not working right now.
No worries. That's why I have it in advance. Okay, cool. You tell me and I'll move the slides forward.
Okay, you can move the slide forward.
All right, cool.
So we're calling this research an historic moment. This is a dramatic value shift in this new world we're in since January of 2020. Next slide. So as I just shared, people's personal values don't really shift from month to month, but we have seen this dramatic shifts across all generations. And it looks like this sort of upheaval is the values that people are experiencing now are looking very similar to the values from the Great Depression. We even looked back at 9/11 and the values did shift dramatically, but there was a difference. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So you can go to the next slide. So we looked at 1,000 people across the US from Gen Z all the way up through boomers. Next slide. So as you see here, these are the top values. These are the values that have gone up. So basically we asked people just a couple of questions. First of all, we put 35 values in front of people and we said to them, which of these values are most important to you? And then we asked them a second question. Which of these values have risen and which of these values have fallen since January of 2020? And what we see on this slide is that there is a dramatic rise in values associated with priorities tied to family and relationships and self-sufficiency. The values rising the most from pre-pandemic levels are protecting the family is up at the top, and actually that's up at the top across all generations. That's not that surprising. We also see values like self-reliance and thrift and helpfulness and simplicity. Actually, simplicity went up across all the generations. That one we saw the most dramatic rise on. Also, honesty and stable relationships. And then something very curious, we saw the value of duty go into the top 10, and we have not seen that value in the top 10 since really the Great Depression. The other thing to mention about duty is that when you think about our youth, the youngest generation we were able to talk to is Gen Z. And so when you think about youth, age 15, 16, 17, you don't think of them as saying duty is in my top 10 values. So that is really sort of representative of the fact that these kids are taking on the weight of the world on their shoulders. And we're going to talk generationally in a minute, a little bit more about Gen Z versus millennials versus boomers and Xers. So if you turn to the next slide, Actually, when everybody sees this, they always say to me, can you give me some OEs, like some of the outtakes? What are people actually saying? So when you look at this, especially when you look at like a Gen Xer, considering what's happening around the world with COVID, it's more important to be self-reliant. I've been staying safe at home, and for the past 10 days, this is a boomer, not being able to go out to eat or to the movies, or every generation's really feeling this in a very big way. You can turn to the next slide. Now, when it comes to the declining values, there is a plunge in values associated with materialism and self-fulfillment. And among the values experiencing the greatest decline from, again, pre-pandemic levels are power and wealth, and even adventure and romance and excitement and ambition. So when you think of values like ambition and excitement going down, you know, we have to sort of ask ourselves, is this going to continue? How are these values going to self-adjust and go back? And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that we saw the value of belonging going up over the last 2 years. And I call belonging a catalyst value. Belonging is connected to other values like safety. When people feel a sense of belonging, they feel safe. They feel like they have a sense of inclusion and trust and purpose even. And when we saw the value of belonging going down, especially now, it didn't even make it into the top 20. We thought this is truly a shift. And so we're going to talk about the role of brands in a minute, but here's where brands and corporations can look at these declining values and say, what can we do to help these people have a more of a sense of belonging and adventure in their lives and a little of excitement? That's where brands and corporations can come in and really use these values to great effect. So you can turn to the next slide. And here, I'm not going to read these out loud. I know everyone's going to have access to this, but I did want to provide a few quotes from the different generations. So if you turn to the next slide. So let's talk about the generations, because here's where it starts getting really interesting. Next slide. What we see here is for all the different generations. So I'm going to focus on ambition first. So there is a considerable drop in the value of ambition. But if you look on this slide and you look at Gen Z, for Gen Z, this value actually rose to the #1 value. But when you work with values, it's really important to see the values that flank the shifts in values. So the value of working hard and protecting the family and even thrift has really risen for Gen Z. And remember, these kids are young. I mean, these are teenagers and kids in their early 20s. So we're thinking that since ambition's #1, it's not for egoic reasons or status or wealth with Gen Z. That has rose to the #1 place because they really have a sense of, I have ambition because I want to protect my family. My ambition is really to save the world here. So that's a really important thing to look at. We also see that the characteristic idealism, which has really defined millennials their entire lives, it looks like this is becoming a little bit more sober for millennials, especially now their parents, you know, the oldest millennials are around 43 years old. We see values like self-reliance and helpfulness and working hard and even thrift edge out for millennials, values like enjoying life and even having fun. And even further down the list for millennials are values like social responsibility. And that's very curious when we see that, because millennials sort of reinvented purpose as they started getting older. So that's another thing to really keep your eyes on when it comes to brands and corporations, marketing and engaging with millennials, not only on the outside buying their products, but also internally as employees. And then the last thing I'll mention here is Gen Xers and Boomers. Xers have always been the most practical generation. They're probably the most likely equipped to handle another downturn. But even for them, we see values like simplicity rise to #2 from 15. Values like freedom and enjoying life are becoming much less of a focus. And then for Boomers, what was interesting when we looked at the research is that thrift has risen 13 ranks. But even more important than that, they are the only generation that put social responsibility in the top 10. And for everyone else, it went down. And we hypothesize that this means that it really demonstrates this generation's continued desire to leave a legacy, especially for their millennial kids. So I think we're going to see more older people get more involved in social responsibility and doing good practices in their lives. Okay, so that sort of gives you a look at the generations. You can turn to the next slide. And then these are just give you some OEs. Again, can you flip to the next slide? So these are, well, I sort of already talked about this in terms of the values that have gone down, but it's really important when you study values to put the values that go down against the values that go up, because that's where the most dynamic stories are told. So I sort of already went through the values that are going down by generation. But before I open it up, actually, you can turn to the next slide. Before I open it up, I mean, everyone asks us, when you look at these values, what are some big conclusions that you kind of hypothesize based on these values? And I think the biggest thing that we've learned from this, even apart from what you see on the screen here, is that the number one thing that we saw from the outtakes of this research is that people really want brands to have empathy right now. Almost like what we were talking about before this call began, empathy and love, and how are brands really wrapping their arms around the people right now, because people are looking to brands and people are looking to their own places of work to help them through this crisis. So I think being empathetic and caring, invite the conversation in, and then show people that you listened. It's very important for corporations and brands to offer very practical solutions to what people are going through right now. And we've seen that demonstrated across so many brands that have really come to the rescue of people right now. And I'm hoping that that continues. Also to keep it simple and avoid information that's complicated, or of course, any inadvertent exploitation of brands. That's a big no-no. I also think that since we saw protecting the family rise to the number one value across generations, I think it's more important than ever to show your people inside your corporation how you're protecting them. Because their well-being is definitely a direct reflection of your company and your brand. And remember, people really don't need to know how bad it is. They don't need to keep being reminded that we are in, a troubled time. They definitely know it. I think what they need right now is kind of a light at the end of the tunnel as we guide them as they make their way into what has definitely become a bit of a new normal. So on this slide, what we have here is just a few key takeaways. One is there's definitely a heightened need for stakeholder listening. No doubt about it. It's really the job of brands and corporations to be sure that their communications and actions are aligned with the control and the empowerment that their stakeholders are now seeking. I mean, number two, a premium on problem solving. I can't emphasize that enough. What are you doing to help people in their own communities solve for big issues? And everybody has a little bit of a different issue right now that they're dealing with. There's also a greater sensitivity toward economic pressures. We're all feeling that right now. So what are we all doing, brands, corporations, to help people in that regard as well? And then the final one, we sort of brainstorming at the agency, it's like return to simple and classic pleasures. People are dying for that right now. So that's about it. That's the research.